Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. Today we're going to hit a new subject by talking about the potential trade targets that the Jaguars could look for this offseason. The players we'll talk about are ones that have speculated to potentially be on the move since the start of the 2022 NFL season, so the current status may be in question for some, but there are still rumors that these guys could be available. So we're going to take a look at them and see what we might be able to find here. So I've got 7 guys that we're going to discuss today that I found, and we'll go generally in order of lower risk players, or I guess that's not a good way to describe it. Guys that wouldn't be as high profile, not as big of moves, and then we'll get into some bigger ones at the end. So to kick this off, we've actually got 2 players from the New York Jets, both at the receiver position. The first one we're going to talk about is Elijah Moore. So Elijah Moore is going into his 3rd season with the New York Jets. He has played predominantly before between the slot and wide, played a lot out wide to start off, but he has moved into the slot as of recently, and we'll see that here actually. So these are all the weeks throughout the season, and so you see early on he's playing a lot more out wide, more snaps there. When he comes back later in the year, they moved him back into the slot. So the nice thing here with Elijah Moore though is you see he can do it all. Despite being 5'10", he's able to play in all those spots. And not only that, but Elijah Moore going into his 3rd year, you have him on your team 2 more seasons. You know that he can be an effective receiver, and he's a fast player as well. I'll look up the 40 time here, but I believe it was a 4.36. It's pretty quick. 4.34, so that's actually as fast as Agnew's was. So Elijah Moore, I think he might make sense as a player the Jaguars could look at. Now, as far as his worth, when he was being potentially shopped last year, people were making calls about him. New York Jets were declining a lot of those calls. They didn't want to trade him at that point. Obviously, we see that not a lot changed since then as far as his issues with the team, but Elijah Moore was being offered for about a 4th rounder, kind of in that range, and with another year off of his rookie deal, it's likely that compensation could be less. So maybe we see the Jaguars offer say a couple 6th rounders. Or maybe they still offer a 4th and they get a late pick back in return. And I think for a player like Elijah Moore, that could make a lot of sense. But we will talk about the issues here too. My biggest problem with acquiring him is that one of his issues with the New York Jets was his usage on the offense. He looked at himself as a starting receiver there. And I think he was very fair in seeing himself that way. I think he was deserving of that role. Yet, even though he was on the field a decent amount, he wasn't getting the ball a lot. And, there's some games where he'd go off, but generally a lot of the problem with that was just Zach Wilson not being that great. He's obviously not had his NFL career pan out the way he wanted it. And so, if Elijah Moore comes to Jacksonville, I don't think you're seeing him on the field nearly as much as you see him here. I think he'd be used, but I think Elijah Moore would be more of a rotational guy, more of an offensive weapon sort of dude. And so I could see that being an issue for him because of his already issues with the team in New York. And I'm just not sure if that's going to fit for the Jaguars, but if they were able to acquire him and they felt confident that he could be used as your 4th receiver, on the offense, I think it's a good move. I think it would be. But that's a big if. I'm not sure that that would be the case. So we'll move on to our next guy, Denzel Mims. So Denzel Mims, he's been around for a year longer. Also a second-round selection by the Jets. He's got a lot of the same speed, slightly slower. I think he ran a 4.38, so he's still kind of a speed threat that the Jaguars are looking for. Reason why we bring up the 4-yard dash for both these players is because we are looking for a fast player. That's the big need at receiver right now. Denzel Mims, he's a guy I remember talked about as a potential first-round selection when he came out. A lot of potential. Ultimately, though, the Jets just haven't had use for him. They haven't got him on the field. I mean, you see it here. Like, he's played 272 snaps this last season. That is not a lot of time on the field at all. And I think that's pretty easy to say. Like, I mean, a lot of players can get up around 1,000 snaps on a year. So you're seeing Denzel Mims sit on the bench a lot, just not being used there. And so because of that, the value here is really low as far as what the Jets would be getting back. And we have to consider that because we're not looking for a starting receiver necessarily in this. So Mims, you're probably looking at a 6th or 7th rounder, maybe a 7th. I mean, that would be pretty good capital to have to give up for him. You'd like that. But at the same time, being a 2nd rounder and having been in the league for 3 years, Denzel Mims is on a 1-year deal. That's all that's left. And so essentially, if you trade for him, you've got him for 1 year. He either doesn't work out and you probably don't keep him, or if he works out, what are you going to pay him? I mean, are you going to have a scenario where you can pay him something you're comfortable with to be your backup receiver? I don't know if that happens. So the way you got to look at this is that it's very likely that he's just around for a season. And I hope that wouldn't be the case if they got him, but there's a good chance that's the way things fold out. But maybe they could find something there. I mean, you saw them do it with Zay Jones and Christian Kirk, and heck, I mean, I'll throw Evan Ingram in there because people almost consider him a receiver. All these guys, they found a way to have them get into career seasons. So could they do something with Denzel Mims? I think they could. I don't think it's a 600, 700-yard season, but I think they could use him pretty well. And so I think it really comes down to how you want to acquire your receiver, because there's different ways you could go. You could go after a Paris Campbell or Mecole Hardman in free agency. You could also look to draft someone, but you could also trade a late draft pick like that where you're really not going to get anything and just solve the issue. I think that makes a ton of sense too. And I mean, you look at our 7th round selections recently, I don't know of a single one that's playing an important role on the team, So, not an insanely important trade, but something they could look at. So now that we've talked about 2 smaller guys, we're going to get into some bigger names. More fun topics. So we'll talk about Daron Payne. So Daron Payne won't look as much at snaps by position. So he's an interior defensive lineman. For some reason, graded really low on PFF. He had a really good season. So we'll actually take a look at his stats. So I believe he was, double-digit sacks, 11.5 on the year. Super effective pass rusher. And like we mentioned, it's on the interior. That's the place that the Jaguars need help the most. And so getting a guy like Daron Payne on your team is an instant upgrade and arguably the thing that this team needs to be successful in the pass rush. Getting pressure in the face of the quarterback is different from getting pressure on the sides, because it's when it's in his face, he's got to roll out, He's got to throw on the run, whereas when it's on the side, he can just step up in the pocket. So, getting pressure from everywhere, where's he going to go? That's why you care about the interior pass rush for the Jaguars. And I think there's only a limited amount of ways they could address that this offseason. I don't think you're going to get anyone in the draft that's going to be great for that unless you're taking a shot on like a Mozzie Smith in like the second round, which I don't know a ton about him, but he's a second round selection. He's not like a bona fide star. There's not a guy who's really in range for the Jaguars in round 1 other than maybe Brian Brissy. And I think he's going to go off the board a lot earlier. So you're kind of limited in the draft. And if you're doing it through free agency, you're going to spend a ton of money on the position to get someone who's going to be impactful. Or maybe you get Dalvin Tomlinson and pay him $8 million a year or whatever it is, and he does something for you. But there's not a ton of options, and Daron Payne's another option because he's a guy you could trade for. And I say trade because even though Daron Payne is currently slated to be a free agent, he's either going to re-sign with the Washington Commanders on a long deal, or they're going to franchise tag him and trade him. I could not see a scenario where they just let him go, and then he hits free agency and a team signs him. I guess they would get a third-round compensatory pick, but if you trade him, you're already going to probably get at least a third-rounder, and that third-rounder will be worth more than the compensatory pick, because the compensatory pick is at the end of the third round. So I think they're franchise tagging him at least. So there's a chance he's available if that happens. Now, should the Jaguars get Daron Payne? Well, if you get him, you're going to have to negotiate a long-term deal. And the good thing about that is that you can backload that deal. You can have a minimal hit to the salary cap this year. But Daron Payne is going to cost a lot of money. We'll look at his spot rack evaluation. I believe it's around $20 million. And this isn't always correct. But yeah, $19.4 million. I think that's pretty spot on with what you're looking at there. That's a lot of money to pay someone. And it's not just that which you're giving up, but you're giving up probably a second-round selection for him. I think that's where he's probably going to fall as far as trade value. So do you want to give up a shot at a really good player in the second round who could be impactful to get a player you're going to pay roughly $20 million a year? I mean, I like Daron Payne as a player, but what you have to sacrifice and in the position you're in, I don't think it makes a ton of sense unless you don't got to send a draft pick. And I just don't think the Commanders let him see free agency. Another issue with me for Daron Payne is that I've watched like some of his interviews recently as the Jaguars were kind of linked to him as, maybe this is the guy that we address the pass rush with this offseason. And to me, I mean, I'm not going to blame him for caring about money. That's important. And I'm sure he wants to earn more, and he wants to earn as much as he can for himself, for his family, for all those things. But it seems like the way he talks that everything is about money. A little too much, at least. So I'm not huge on that. I want to get players in here that want to play football first, care about that the most. Not that he doesn't care about football, but I don't want to get people who are just more focused on earning money. You got to love your job and want to be a part of it, and I think that needs to be the first priority. And I just didn't honestly get good vibes from the way he talked about it. So for me, I probably won't look at Payne too closely unless he's available in free agency. I think that's the best way you could acquire him. Now, we'll talk about one more interior defensive lineman here. So Aaron Donald is a name that's floated around a little bit. And everyone knows who Aaron Donald is, I'm sure. Aaron Donald is arguably the best interior defensive lineman of all time. Hell of a player. I mean, he's got to be among the best to ever do it. And so the question around Aaron Donald right now is, first of all, whether he's going to come back. Because he put up, I think it was on his bio on social media, put out that he was a retired player. When people caught it, he changed it back. And so now we don't know if he's going to be back. We don't know if that's even going to be with the Rams. So there's a question about whether he wants to play the game still. Now, if Aaron Donald wants to play football, that's got to be a great choice for your team. So we'll look at wrong tab. Look at Aaron Donald and how he's performed, just to give you a reminder. Now, this last season was not nearly as good, and I'm sure he'd probably have to restructure with the team he goes to. Aaron Donald right now, he's 31 years old, and he's had a lot of double-digit sack seasons. This last year wasn't one of them. But you see all these years before, great seasons, and he even hit 20 in 2018. He would be a great player to have around, but the issue you're going to run into with Aaron Donald, actually two issues. One is that he would probably cost a first rounder at this point just because of how great of a player he has been, his legacy, that will matter. And so you're going to give up a huge draft pick to acquire him. And not only that, but his contract is massive. He gets paid like $30 million a year. And thankfully, some of that will be paid by the Rams if they trade him, because some of that is money that's signing bonus. He's already earned it. And so you won't pay him necessarily $30 million a year, but you are paying him a ton of money still. And so, I'll be honest, I don't fully understand investigating this scenario as far as how much it costs each year. That's a little questionable. But I will just say he's not going to be cheap. It's going to make it a lot harder to bring back your free agents, and either you're restructuring about every contract on your team or someone's got to go. So, Aaron Donald, for me, I think even if he wants to play again, I just won't bring him back because he seems like a player who's going to be on the decline, who's not going to be as good as what he's being paid. I would rather get a guy who, if they're around that age, is being paid around what he's worth. Rather than we're going to pay him $15-20 million a year and he's going to get 7 or 8 sacks. Not that that's just the worst thing in the world, but I don't think that's worth $15-20 million a year. So that's how I feel about Aaron Donald. Now, Jalen Ramsey is the next guy we'll talk about, who will probably piss off a few people, honestly. But you either love him or you hate him, honestly. And for me, I don't hate him, I guess, but I also don't love him very much. So I just think for him, as enticing as it sounds, because he can play in the slot even, you can fix your defense immediately. It will elevate your defense right off the bat. My problem with him is the personality and what he brings back to the team. I don't think it's a good fit with what they've done. I think you're inviting back that old culture. And I don't even necessarily think that he would be exactly the same as he was before. I think he would control it better. But I think after a while, that old personality would start to come back. And I think it would kind of seep into the locker room. And so when I'm bringing in players, I want to be really careful about who I'm bringing in. I don't want to get anyone on this team that I think is going to hurt the culture. Because I think that culture needs to build for a while and stick around. Obviously, that culture was built this last year. I think it's pretty much established here as far as what we expect, but I think it needs to be around a little bit before we can look to bring in those kinds of players and have them assimilate to the system here. So for Jalen Ramsey, that's my biggest issue. And maybe it is a non-issue. Maybe things change. And if they do, that's awesome. But I just don't think that it would make a ton of sense for this team, especially from a salary cap standpoint. So you look at how he performed this last year. So, not really much of a fall off. He's still one of the best corners in the NFL, and some people will argue the best. We'll look at his stats as well. Not as many, he had about as many interceptions. Surprisingly, he's never had over 4 in a season. That kind of shocks me. He also got his first sacks last year as well. The big thing with Ramsey is really just his coverage and his ability to prevent people from getting tons of yards. But, I mean, you look at how many yards he gave up this last year, 700. Maybe that compares all right to the past. Actually, look at that. No, it does not. He gave up double what he did before. So, I just don't think for that money that it's worth bringing in Jalen Ramsey to this team. And the risk that you're carrying that he brings back some of that old culture. So, I apologize that a lot of these guys we're talking about, and these are really like the only candidates that I can find right now for this team that you could even really talk about, because we're not going to talk about like Derek Carr. Obviously, we've got a quarterback. I don't think there's just a ton of people on the trade block at this point that we know of that can go to this team. Now, there will be one, potentially two we talk about out of the 2 remaining that I think the Jaguars could go after. So we will have some that I think will be good fits. For a lot of these guys we've already talked about, I don't think it makes too much sense. I think, Ramsey, it's the culture fit. It's the money. Aaron Donald, it's the money. Is he going to play or want to play? Daron Payne, is it about the money or is it about football? That's my concern. Maybe that's just me. And then Denzel Mims and Elijah Moore, those are more of the low-risk moves, the not as big of splashes, but just good depth for your team. I think both of those could work. Not that you would do both, but I think you could look at both of them and choose one. So let's hop into our last 2 we'll talk about. So we've actually written articles on both of these players. DeAndre Hopkins is the first guy we'll look at. So this all started before the wild card game. I remember I was driving down to Jacksonville, fun 18-hour drive, and saw a rumor come across Twitter and essentially from a verified source that DeAndre Hopkins wanted to be traded, and there were 2 places he wanted to play, which were Jacksonville and Los Angeles with the Chargers. And that kind of shocked me, because I didn't think, a year after what happened with Urban Meyer and where the team was last year, that we would have players like that wanting to come here. Even if we fix things, I didn't think that there would be that kind of interest. And yet, DeAndre Hopkins is apparently saying he wants to come to this team. And, I did investigation and I did research, and I think that there is an actual argument for DeAndre Hopkins playing in Jacksonville. I also do think there's some counter arguments, but I think there's some good reason to bring him in. First of all, you look at how good of a player DeAndre Hopkins is. I think there was a point, just the last couple of years where people would argue that he was the best receiver in the NFL. That was a fair argument to make. And DeAndre Hopkins, when you're acquiring him, you will probably be able to get him for less value than what you would expect to normally. Because this last year, he was out for part of the season. It had to do with a substance abuse policy, and it was one of those things where it didn't seem like he actually did something wrong, but he accidentally had some type of substance in his system. It's happened quite a bit to players, and Hopkins is not a guy, quite frankly, that I would be concerned about with character issues. Just does not seem like that kind of person. And so he was out part of the year. I believe he also has been hurt at times. So the value you would have to give up to Arizona, I don't think is as large. Now, if you're trading for DeAndre Hopkins, that right off the bat, along with Calvin Ridley, is probably your two number one receivers. And Christian Kirk, the way I see him, he's a 1B or a 2A. He's really just right in between as far as where he's at. And I think there's a good argument that you could consider him as a 1. Especially after getting 1,100 yards in a season. But I think DeAndre Hopkins, immediately comes in and turns that receiving core into one of the best in the NFL. And you also look at the salary cap implications. I believe the numbers, it's $12 million and then $22 million that you're paying him. So it's $34 million essentially. I'll swap this over so we can actually look at some stuff here. So that's it's a bit of money, but when you look at what receivers are getting paid now, I don't think it's anything too crazy at all to pay him $17 million over 2 seasons. Especially if you think he's going to be among the best in the NFL. That's a pretty good deal to acquire a player like that for that value. Now, the two problems that I have with this are basically Christian Kirk and Zay Jones. I bring up Christian Kirk because when he was with DeAndre Hopkins in Arizona, he did not have the opportunity to break out as a receiver. And maybe you could make the argument that having Calvin Ridley on this team is sort of the same thing, where you have a receiver that could overshadow him and limit him. But with DeAndre Hopkins coming in, I think that would have to be investigated if he was traded for. Is that a problem for Christian Kirk? I don't think Christian Kirk would necessarily have anything to say about DeAndre Hopkins where, I don't like him, I don't want to be around him. I think it's more so, you put faith in Christian Kirk to be that kind of receiver. Are you going to the next offseason get the guy that was keeping him from being a number 1? I think the question has to be asked whether or not it's right or wrong, or yes or no. The other part of this is Zay Jones, and it'll be what we talk about as well for our last trade candidate. It's really hard for me to want to bring in another receiver that badly when I know that a player like Zay Jones, who has meant a ton to this team, been a part of so much this last year, who doesn't cost a lot either, it just, as a person, fits perfectly into Jacksonville. It's really hard for me to want to trade for another receiver to take his spot, because that's essentially what's happening if you're bringing in someone. That is a huge issue with that. Maybe not everyone feels the same. I highly doubt everyone feels the same. There's probably a lot of people out there who fairly say, well, it's an upgrade to the receiving core. We need to look after that. That's fine. I have nothing against having that opinion. I just don't fully agree with that opinion. And so, I think you have to heavily consider whether that's going to hurt Zay Jones on this team or not. Now, if Zay Jones embraces being a rotational player, coming in for less of the snaps, and I think you can kind of just have all these players play around, 80, 90% of the time, and then get Zay in there more, to where he's in like 75-70% of the time. I think that is possible. But, you have to make sure that you're not going to alienate the players you already have, the players who believed in what you've done and are your core guys. So, if you can get past that, I would acquire DeAndre Hopkins. I think it would be a really good move. However, I think if another guy's available, I don't think DeAndre Hopkins is the best move you can make. I think T. Higgins is the best acquisition this team can make through a trade this offseason. And I don't think it's that close. T. Higgins, the biggest thing if you're trading for him, what I would absolutely want to try to find a way to do, as much as I like Cam Robinson as a player, I think if you're trying to acquire T. Higgins for what he's going to be worth, what he's going to cost, I would try to send a package to Cincinnati where you throw in Cam Robinson, you throw in that left tackle, or just that really good offensive lineman that Cincinnati needs. Because Cincinnati desperately needs help on the offensive line. You give them that back. Yeah, they're going to have to pay a bit for it, but their cap hit would be $12 million and then $22 million the next year. It's actually the exact same as what we talked about with Hopkins. It's not anything too insane for the Bengals to take on. At the same time, T. Higgins' contract shouldn't be anything too insane, you'd think, but here they are not getting it done. But if he's on the trade block, I would send them an offer, say Cam Robinson and a 3rd or 4th rounder. One of those picks. And if they were able to accept that, I would take it. And here's the reason why. To start, with the salary cap, you are in a better salary cap situation for the next 2 seasons. As crazy as that sounds. Everyone wants to say right off the bat, okay, you're acquiring a great player, you're going to have to pay him all this money, it's going to screw over your financial situation. It does not do that until after the next 2 seasons. T. Higgins, right now, I think the number we're kind of looking at, and I might be wrong with this, so don't fully quote me, understand I could be off. And if it's a little bit more, I'd still consider it. Say he's worth $22.5 million a year as a receiver. That's exactly the same as what Cam Robinson is being paid these next 2 years. Now, Cam Robinson's deal was worth $17 million a year. However, the first year he was paid $7 million as far as official salary cap numbers. He got a $15 million signing bonus, and then $5 million of that signing bonus was factored into the $7 million. So he's already been paid a significant portion, but some of that signing bonus is still on the books the next 2 years. So this year, if you traded Cam Robinson away, you're taking on $10 million in dead cap and saving $12 million. Or 12-something million. If you bring in T. Higgins, the Bengals, out of his $4 million contract for this next season, pay $1 million of it in dead cap, and we take on $3 million. So you save about $9 million that first year. So now, after that trade, you have more money available to re-sign your free agents this season. And the next year, when you sign a new deal, even if you did not backload the contract, if you paid him $22.5 million a year, and you paid him that year, $22.5 million, that is the same you would be paying Cam Robinson. So the next 2 years, T. Higgins is more affordable than Cam Robinson. And you'd be giving up either a late day 2 pick or an early day 3 pick. That would be my guess. If you even had to give up a little more, I would still consider it. And so as far as T. Higgins as a player, he is instantly a huge upgrade to the offense, and I think you could make an argument that he is the best receiver on the offense. Now, we'll see how that plays out. Maybe he is not. And I think if you had that kind of receiving core, it would rotate around a lot. who was the dominant player, because I think you've got 3 guys that would just be really damn good. Those being Calvin Ridley, Christian Kirk, and T. Higgins. So Higgins is already a great player, comes in, and you're forcing your opponents to have to game plan against 3 high caliber, highly touted, highly talented receivers, which is dang near impossible to do. This receiving core would be better than what Cincinnati has right now. I do believe that. And then you already got Evan Ingram at tight end and Travis Etienne at running back and Trevor Lawrence at quarterback. It's crazy. And let's talk about Trevor Lawrence. This was his best receiver in college. T. Higgins was. And T. Higgins also played with Travis Etienne. You get those 3 guys back together? Is that not a great story? Do they not have some chemistry already? I mean, that makes a ton of sense. You get Lawrence, his former receiver, that he's already got chemistry with, that he won a national championship with, a receiver that goes for over 1,000 yards a season. That's a damn good choice. I mean, we might have 3 receivers on this team that go over 1,000 yards if we go after this. We save money, and ultimately, you have 2 issues with this. One is that down the road, if you want to keep all these receivers, you're going to be paying a lot of money. I think when we look at it, you'll be around 60 to 65 million a year for your receiving core on average. That's a lot of money. But if they're game breakers, if they're like unguardable, then okay, pay them, Like your other positions, try to keep it cheap, try to get new talent there. You don't got to worry about drafting receivers, at least for a while. So that's one issue. And the other one is, like we talked about earlier, Zay Jones. Because he would be demoted once again in this scenario. And so that would be an issue for sure. But honestly, if you're acquiring a player like Higgins, I think that move is just way more valuable than what you have here right now. To have T. Higgins on this team, I think, is absolutely an upgrade over Zay Jones. And I think you could still use Zay Jones well, have him be an effective part of this offense. If you have anyone go down to injury, you already have a really good receiver that can step in. So it makes sense to me. I think out of all these moves, just to kind of wrap this up, I would consider the T. Higgins move. That would probably be my top one. I would consider DeAndre Hopkins. I wouldn't be huge on it, but I would be okay with it. Ramsey, probably a no. Aaron Donald would be a no for me. Daron Payne, unless I'm just off on some tangent that's not realistic about him, and it's not going to come down to the money or any of that, that's not a big deal, then, maybe he could be traded for. But that's just the way I feel about him. And if you're unable to land any of these top receivers, I think Elijah Moore would be the best guy you could find for the 4th position at your receiving core. But at the same time, I'm not sure that he's going to want to be in that kind of role. I think he wants to go to a team where he's going to start. So it really comes down to the situation there. And Denzel Mims, sort of a low risk, high reward. It's unlikely that you get that high reward, but it'd be an alright move. You're trading late capital for it. So hopefully we could have some more of these videos as the offseason goes on. Hopefully we'll hear about some more players. Right now, a lot of the talk is about bigger prospects, and we've got some guys that have made sense from last year around the trade deadline that weren't moved. That may not be as big, but some of those guys too are free agents now. They were guys in final years. So we'll learn more as the month goes on, and as we get closer to free agency. We're almost a month away now, and it's going to be a great time. I do think, even though this team said they're not going to be huge spenders, I think they're still going to make a few moves. They'll have some money for it. They'll put it together. The way they'll function and the way they're going to function with these trades is that they're going to look to address their issues before the draft. And quite frankly, that's how you got to do it. Because when you go to the draft, you want to get the best players on the board. So I think that's how they'll look at this. And, maybe we see one more big trade. It just really depends on the kind of players available. And I'm sure something big's going to happen before we get to free agency as far as trades. It always does. So, that said, thank you for watching today. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you want to see anything specific on the channel. At this point, definitely looking for more ideas on what to talk about. It's kind of the dead part of the year, but I enjoy making this content. I enjoy talking about the Jaguars, so if we got stuff to talk about, we will talk about it. So thank you for taking this time. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and see you in the next video.